Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are tackling a topic that, frankly, sounds like a wish fulfillment fantasy.
It really does.
You know those headlines you see, eat chocolate, live forever, or why chocolate is better than the gym.
Right.
And usually we just roll our eyes at those, we file them away with, wine counts as a fruit serving.
Exactly. Or pizza being a vegetable.
But today, we're digging into a massive stack of research. Cochrane reviews, meta-analyses, chemical safety reports that suggest that under very, very specific conditions, there might actually be some truth to it.
It's a seductive idea, isn't it? The concept that our indulgence could actually be our medicine.
It is.
And to be fair, the data is there, but it is incredibly nuanced. If you go into this thinking a king-size candy bar from the gas station is going to save your heart, you're going to be sorely disappointed.
Oh, for sure.
In fact, you might even make things worse.
Right. So that is our mission today. We're going to separate the candy from the medicine. We're stripping away all the sugar, the milk, the marketing, and we are looking exclusively at the biochemistry of high cacao dark chocolate. And when I say high, we are talking strictly 85% or higher.
Exact.
We need to understand why this specific food acts the way it does on a cellular level.
Yes. We're not looking at chocolate as this one monolithic thing. We're looking at the cocoa bean as a delivery system for bioactive compounds.
Bioactive compounds.
Right. And we're going to look at robust meta-analyses and these massive clinical trials like the Cosmo study to see what happens when you treat cocoa as a supplement rather than a dessert.
Okay, so I have to admit, in the spirit of research, I brought a bar of 90% dark chocolate into the studio today.
Of course you did.
I took a bite before we started, and it is an intense experience.
It's not dessert, is it?
No, it is not. It's dry, it's bitter, and it has this earthy, almost fermented quality. It demands your attention. It actually kind of dries your mouth out a little bit.
That astringency you're tasting, that's the tannins. And that bitterness, that's the first and most important lesson of this deep dive.
Okay.
If it tastes like candy, it's candy. The medicinal properties, the things that interact with your biology, are found in compounds called flavanols. And flavanols, by their very nature, are bitter.
So the bitterness is actually a good sign.
The bitterness is the signal that the medicine is present. If a company processes that bitterness out entirely, they've likely removed all the benefits along with it.
Okay, so we're going to embrace the bitterness today.
Yeah.
Because the stack of research we have suggests this compound can mimic the effects of certain heart medications.
Yeah.
It can change how your brain processes oxygen, and there's even a link to insulin sensitivity that I found completely counterintuitive.
It is counterintuitive until you understand the mechanism. But yes, we're going to cover the cardiovascular powerhouse effects, the brain benefits, both the hype and the reality. And we also need to have a very serious talk about heavy metals.
And the processing. The Dutching disaster.
The Dutching disaster. It is the single biggest trap for consumers, and it renders most dark chocolate you see on the shelf biologically useless.
Okay, let's unpack all this. We should start where the evidence is strongest. And I was surprised to see that the strongest evidence isn't actually about mood or energy. It's about the heart.
That's exactly right. The cardiovascular system is where we see the most robust, high-grade evidence. And to understand why, we have to talk about a molecule called nitric oxide.
Nitric oxide, or NO. This is the mechanism that just keeps popping up in all the literature. It seems to be the linchpin for everything.
It is the star of the show. So let's zoom in. Inside the cocoa bean, you have these phytonutrients called flavanols, and specifically one called epicatogen.
Epicatogen.
When you ingest that epicatogen, it travels through your system and eventually interacts with the lining of your blood vessels, a layer called the endothelium.
And the endothelium isn't just a passive pipe, right? I read that it's more like an active organ.
That is a crucial distinction. The endothelium is incredibly dynamic. It's the single layer of cells that lines your entire vascular system, from your aorta all the way down to the tiniest capillary.
Wow.
And it's constantly sensing blood flow and pressure. When the epicatogen hits the endothelium, it triggers an enzyme that's specifically designed to produce nitric oxide.
Okay, and what does nitric oxide actually do to the vessel once it's released?
Think of it as a relaxant. It sends a signal to the smooth muscle cells that are wrapped around the arteries to just let go, to chill out. And this causes the vessel to widen.
So it's basically plumbing. If you widen the pipe, the pressure goes down and the flow gets better.
Precisely. It turns a narrow, tense garden hose into a wide-open fire hose. And we can actually measure this with incredible precision using a test mentioned in our sources.
Oh, the flow-mediated dilation test.
Exactly, the FMD test. It's the gold standard.
That's where they use an ultrasound, right?
Yes. They'll put a blood pressure cuff on your arm, tighten it to stop blood flow for a few moments, and then release it. Then they use an ultrasound to watch how quickly and how wide the artery in your arm opens up to accommodate that rush of blood. It's a direct measure of how flexible and healthy your arteries are.
And what does the data say about chocolate and this FMD test?
It's remarkably consistent across multiple studies. The meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials show that regular consumption of high flavanol cocoa improves FMD by about 1.34%.
Now, I can hear the listener right now saying 1.34%. That sounds like a rounding error. That's tiny.
It sounds tiny to a layperson, but in cardiovascular medicine, it is huge. Absolutely huge.
Really?
To put it in context, a 1% improvement in FMD isn't just a number. It correlates with a significant reduction in your risk of future cardiovascular events, things like heart attacks and strokes.
So how significant are we talking?
We're talking about a 13% lower risk for every 1% improvement in some of the epidemiological models. So shifting that needle by 1.34% just by eating something is biologically profound.
That is wild. So it's not just good for you in some vague way. It's literally mechanically changing the elasticity of your vascular system.
Yes. You are reducing what's called arterial stiffness. As we age, our arteries tend to get stiff and rigid.
Like an old rubber band.
Exactly, like an old rubber band that's lost its snap. That rigidity forces the heart to pump harder, which raises your blood pressure. Cocoa flavanols help keep those arteries flexible like new rubber.
And this directly translates to the blood pressure numbers we see on the cuff, right? I saw reductions of about 2 to 4 millimeters of mercury.
Correct. The systolic blood pressure, that's a top number, tends to drop by about 2 to 4 points on average in the studies.
Okay, but we need to be realistic here.
Absolutely. If you have severe hypertension, if your blood pressure is, 180 over a 110, chocolate is not going to replace your medication.
Right. Disclaimer. We are not doctors. This is not medical advice.
Please do not do that.
If you're in the danger zone, you listen to your cardiologist.
Exactly. But if you're pre-hypertensive or if you're looking for those lifestyle interventions to keep your numbers healthy, a 3-point drop is actually very significant.
How significant?
It's comparable to what we see with things like major salt reduction or starting a moderate exercise routine. It is a meaningful clinical shift.
And the sources mention that this effect is most pronounced in people who already have elevated blood pressure to begin with.
That's a common theme you see in nutrition science. It's often called the ceiling effect.
Meaning?
If you're a 20-year-old athlete with perfect blood pressure and super flexible arteries, cocoa isn't going to lower your pressure into a danger zone. Your body has checks and balances.
Homeostasis.
Right. But if your system is already stressed, if that endothelium is dysfunctional, which is true for many of us as we age or deal with chronic stress, cocoa steps in and helps restore that natural function.
Okay, there's another cardiovascular aspect that really caught my eye. It moved away from the plumbing of the arteries and looked at the blood itself.
Oh, yes.
The aspirin-like effect.
This is fascinating stuff. We are talking about platelets.
The little guys in your blood that are responsible for clotting.
Right, and platelets are essential. You don't want to bleed to death from a paper cut. But in cardiovascular disease, the worry is that platelets get too sticky.
And they start clumping together.
Exactly. They aggregate. And that clumping can form clots that lead to strokes or heart attacks.
And cocoa stops them from getting so sticky.
It inhibits platelet aggregation. It essentially acts as a mild blood thinner. The data compares it to a very, very low-dose aspirin.
Wow.
It just reduces the overall stickiness of the blood, making it flow more smoothly through those newly widened arteries.
Which is great for preventing clots, but I guess we should flag this for anyone who's already taking blood thinners.
Absolutely. This is a critical safety note and something you need to be aware of.
So if you're on something like warfarin,
or Coumadin, or even just a daily aspirin regimen, and you suddenly start eating 40 grams of 90% dark chocolate every day, you are stacking effects.
you could be amplifying the effect.
You absolutely need to talk to your doctor because you might increase your bleeding risk. It just goes to show how potent this food actually is. It has a legitimate pharmacological effect.
It's not just food, it's a bioactive compound. Okay, so that's the heart. Arteries relaxing, blood pressure dropping, blood thinning. Let's move to the metabolism, because this is where I feel like I'm being punked.
It's a metabolic paradox.
Exactly. We're always told that chocolate, even dark chocolate, is calorie dense. It's a fat. And yet, the research links cocoa consumption to improved insulin sensitivity. How does eating something associated with dessert help us process sugar?
It is deeply ironic, isn't it? But you have to remember, we're not eating the sugar-laden dessert version. We're talking about the cocoa bean itself.
Okay.
The meta-analyses consistently show reductions in fasting insulin and improvements in something called HOMA-IR.
And HOMA-IR is what?
It's a key marker that doctors use to measure insulin resistance. A lower number is better.
So what's the mechanism here? How is it working?
It seems to be happening right at the cellular level. The Flavanols, especially that epicadishin again, seem to help the cells pull glucose out of the blood more efficiently.
How?
They essentially grease the wheels of these things called GLUT4 transporters.
GLUT4.
Think of GLUT4 as specialized doors on your muscle and fat cells. Their only job is to open up and let sugar, or glucose, inside so the cell can burn it for energy.
Okay.
In people with insulin resistance, those doors are kind of rusty. They get stuck shut even when insulin is knocking, so the sugar stays trapped in the blood, causing damage.
And cocoa helps unstick the doors.
It helps unlock those doors. So instead of the sugar floating around in the blood causing inflammation, the cocoa helps shove it into the muscle cells where it belongs.
That's incredible.
And there's more. It also seems to signal the liver to slow down its production of new glucose, so you get a two-pronged attack.
Okay.
Better clearance from the blood and less new production from the liver.
But there is a massive catch here, right? We have to circle back to the vehicle, a chocolate bar itself.
The catch is the vehicle. It's everything. If you consume your cocoa with 20 or 30 grams of sugar, which is what you'd find in a standard chocolate bar, you completely negate this benefit.
You're just fighting yourself.
You are. You're flooding the system with sugar at the exact same time you're trying to improve insulin sensitivity. It's like turning on the air conditioning and opening all the windows on a hot day.
That is why the 85% or higher rule is non-negotiable.
It is absolutely non-negotiable. At 85%, the sugar content is usually very low, low enough that the benefits of the flavanols can actually shine through without being overwhelmed by a glucose spike.
Okay, so let's talk about cholesterol, lipids. I feel like this is always the murky area of nutrition science. Does cocoa act like a statin? Does it slash your cholesterol?
No, it's not a statin. It's not going to dramatically slash your LDL cholesterol numbers. If you have high cholesterol, eating chocolate isn't going to make your LDL drop by 50 points.
So what does it do?
The data shows some modest reductions in triglycerides and maybe a small bump in HDL, the so-called good cholesterol. But there's a nuance here that's really important, maybe more important than the total number itself.
Which is?
Oxidation. It's about oxidation.
Okay, explain that.
We used to think that just having a high number of LDL particles was the only problem. Now we understand that it's the oxidized LDL particles that are the real villains.
What's the difference?
Think of an oxidized LDL particle as a rusted ball bearing. It's rough, it's sticky, and it's much more likely to embed itself in your artery walls to create plaque. That's the start of atherosclerosis.
And cocoa is a powerful antioxidant.
One of the most potent antioxidants we know of. The research suggests that the cocoa flavanols act like a shield. They protect the LDL particles from oxidizing in the first place.
So even if your total number of LDL particles doesn't drop off a cliff,
The quality of your LDL particles improves. They become less dangerous, less likely to cause that plaque buildup.
so it's quality control for your cholesterol. That's a powerful distinction.
That's a great way to put it. It's about risk reduction through quality, not just quantity.
Okay, let's move on to the brain. This is the stuff that I think people really want to be true. We all want a limitless pill.
We do.
And I've seen the claims about preventing dementia, making you smarter, improving memory. What's real here and what's just hype?
We absolutely have to manage expectations here. If we look at that massive Cosmos trial, and this was a huge study, over 21,000 people followed for years. The headline result regarding dementia was
What?
underwhelming.
Underwhelming. Oh, no.
For the general population, taking a cocoa extract supplement every day didn't magically prevent cognitive decline or dementia over the 3-year period of the study.
So it wasn't a magic shield for the brain.
It didn't stop the clock on Alzheimer's for everyone in the way we might have hoped.
Well, that's a bit of a buzzkill.
It is. However, and this is a really big however, there were signals in the data.
Oh.
When they drilled down and looked at subgroups, specifically people who had poor diet quality to begin with, people not eating enough fruits and vegetables, the cocoa extract made a significant difference for them.
Ah. So if you're already eating blueberries and kale and salmon every day, your tank is full. Cocoa might not add much on top of that.
Exactly.
But if your diet is kind of beige,
If you are starting from a nutrient-deprived state, cocoa seems to act like a rescue nutrient for the brain. But there's another angle to the brain story that I find much more compelling for the average person.
And that is?
The acute effect versus the chronic effect. What happens right now, today?
You're talking about the primer effect.
Yes. There are some really interesting studies showing that if you consume a high dose of flavanols, we're talking 500 to 900 milligrams, about 2 hours before a cognitive task, you see improved performance.
2 hours, that's very specific.
That timing correlates with the peak levels of epicatechin metabolites in the bloodstream.
And the mechanism is blood flow.
It's likely cerebral blood flow. Just like it opens the arteries in your heart, we can actually see on fMRI scans that cocoa increases blood flow to the gray matter of the brain.
So you're getting more oxygen and more glucose to your neurons.
Exactly. It's like a mild turbo boost for your brain's engine.
And there was research on fatigue, too.
Yes. One study I found really interesting showed that cocoa reduced both physical and mental fatigue during demanding tasks. It didn't necessarily make people smarter in the sense of raising their IQ.
But it helped them last longer.
It stopped them from tiring out as fast. It preserved their executive function when the brain was under stress.
That is actually huge for productivity. It's not about being a genius. It's about maintaining your focus at 3 p.m. when you usually want to nap.
Precisely. It builds endurance for your brain. Which brings us to the mood aspect.
The depression study. This was specifically on menopausal women, right?
Yes, a fascinating subgroup to study. They took menopausal women and gave them a high cacao chocolate for 8 weeks.
And what happened?
They saw a significant reduction in depression scores compared to the placebo group.
Why menopausal women specifically? What's the theory?
It's likely multifactorial. Menopause is a period often associated with a spike in systemic inflammation, and we know cocoa is powerfully anti-inflammatory.
And what else?
There's also the gut-brain axis. Cocoa acts as a prebiotic. The fiber and polyphenols in it feed the good bacteria in your gut. And we know that a happy, diverse gut microbiome often translates to a happier brain via the vagus nerve.
And we can't talk about mood without talking about theobromine.
My favorite molecule in the bean.
Everyone knows caffeine. But theobromine is the main stimulant in chocolate. How is it different?
They are chemically related, they're cousins, but they act very differently in the body. Caffeine is a pretty harsh central nervous system stimulant.
It can make you jittery.
It hits you fast, it blocks adenosine receptors, and crucially, it acts as a vasoconstrictor in the brain. It actually narrows blood vessels.
And theobromine.
Theobromine is a vasodilator. It opens blood vessels, as we've discussed, and its stimulant effect is much gentler, much smoother, and much longer lasting.
So no jitters, no crash.
Much, much less likely. It provides a mood lift and a sense of alertness without that sharp, anxious edge that too much coffee can give you. It's what I'd call a chill energy.
So that's why you feel focused, but also kind of relaxed after dark chocolate, not wired.
That's the theobromine at work.
Okay, so we have a heart that's pumping efficiently, arteries that are flexible, blood sugar that's behaving, and a brain that's oxygenated and calm. This sounds absolutely perfect, but
Here comes the but, and it is a very big one.
there's a massive trap waiting for us in the grocery store aisle. We have to talk about Dutching.
This is the tragedy of modern chocolate making. It truly is.
What exactly is Dutching? It sounds harmless.
I wish it were. It's a chemical process called alkalization. Basically, raw cocoa is naturally acidic. It has a pH of around 5 or 5.5.
And it tastes pretty sharp, right?
Very sharp, almost citrusy sometimes. Back in the 19th century, a Dutch chemist figured out that if you wash the cocoa beans in an alkaline solution like potassium carbonate, which is essentially a form of soap, you neutralize that acid.
And what does that do to the flavor and the look?
It makes it very mild, smooth, and earthy. It removes all of that bite. It also changes the color, making the cocoa powder much, much darker.
Okay, so it tastes better to the average palate, but what does washing it in alkali do to the good stuff, the flavanols?
It annihilates them. Dutching is a flavanol assassin.
How bad is it?
Depending on how heavy the processing is, Dutching can destroy between 60% and up to 90% of the original flavanols.
90%.
Yes. You could be eating a bar that says 85% cocoa on the front, thinking you're doing something great for your health, but if it has been heavily Dutched, it is biologically dead. It's just fiber and fat.
So you're getting the calories without any of the medicine.
Exactly.
That is infuriating. It feels deceptive. So how do you, the listener, know? How do you avoid this trap?
You have to become a label detective. You have to turn the bar over and look at the ingredients list. If you see the words cocoa processed with alkali or alkalized cocoa, put it back on the shelf.
What if it just says cocoa?
Usually, if it's natural, the manufacturer will want to brag about it. They'll say natural cocoa or
Yeah.
unsweetened cocoa. But that processed with alkali warning is a legal requirement in the US and many other places.
Is there a visual cue?
Yes. Look at the color. This is the big tell.
And darker is better, right? That's what we've always been told.
Actually, no, that's the common misconception. We associate dark chocolate with health. But the Dutching process turns the cocoa very, very dark, almost black.
Like an Oreo cookie.
Exactly like an Oreo cookie. That black color is a sign of ultra-processing. Natural high flavanol cocoa is actually a lighter reddish-brown color.
Reddish brown.
Yes, like the color of a cinnamon stick or a brick. It's counterintuitive, but if your dark chocolate looks like charcoal, it's probably devoid of flavanols. You want that reddish tint.
Okay, label reading is mandatory. Now let's address the other elephant in the room. The recent reports about heavy metals, lead and cadmium.
Yeah?
I saw the Consumer Reports article and the As You Sow data,
Yeah.
and it scared a lot of people away from dark chocolate entirely.
It was a startling report, and it is a real issue. We cannot just brush this under the rug. The cocoa plant is what's known as a bioaccumulator. It sucks up whatever is in the soil around it.
So where are these metals coming from?
Let's break it down by metal. Cadmium comes from the soil itself. It's a naturally occurring element. But some regions, particularly in South America, places with volcanic soil like Ecuador or Peru, tend to have naturally higher levels of cadmium in the ground.
And the plant's roots just pull it up into the bean.
Exactly.
What about lead? Is that from the soil too?
No, lead is different. The cocoa plant doesn't really absorb lead through its roots. Lead contamination happens after the harvest. The beans are fermented and then dried outside in the sun, often on the side of roads or on concrete patios in developing nations. Dust that contains lead from old leaded gasoline residues in the soil or local industry settles on the sticky outer shells of the beans during this drying process.
So it's environmental pollution just settling on the food.
Precisely. So what do we do about this? We don't want to lose all the benefits. The solution is smart sourcing.
You mentioned South America has higher cadmium. Is there a region with lower levels?
Generally speaking, cocoa from West Africa, places like Ghana or the Ivory Coast, tends to be lower in cadmium because the soil composition is just different.
Okay.
But it can be hard to find single-origin West African bars sometimes, as a lot of that cocoa goes into big bulk blends for major manufacturers.
The sources did list some safer choice brands based on independent testing. I think it's worth naming them so people have a place to start.
Absolutely. Based on the testing from Consumer Reports and others, brands like Ghirardelli, specifically their Intense Dark 86% bar tested quite well for lower metal content.
That's a widely available one.
It is. Taza and Mast were also on the safer list.
And interestingly, the sources mentioned that the organic label doesn't necessarily save you here.
No, it doesn't, and that really upsets people. But you have to remember, heavy metals are natural elements. An organic farm in volcanic soil will still have high cadmium in its beans. Organic certifies no pesticides, not no heavy metals.
That is a crucial distinction.
It is.
So look for brands that test their products, or stick to the ones that have performed well in these independent studies. And I suppose the dose matters.
The dose makes the poison. If you're eating a huge 100-gram bar every single day, your risk goes up. But at the medicinal doses we're about to talk about, the risk is generally considered manageable compared to the massive cardiovascular benefit.
Let's get into that dosage. We've sold the benefits, we've warned about the Dutching and the metals. How much should you actually eat to get that nitric oxide boost and the brain primer effect?
The clinical trials, the ones that showed the real blood pressure reduction and the blood flow improvements, typically use a dose of between 500 and 900 milligrams of Flavanols per day.
Okay, translating that to a chocolate bar.
Yeah.
Which doesn't list Flavanols on the nutrition label.
No, it doesn't, which is tricky. But as a rough rule of thumb, with a high-quality non-Dutched 85% or 90% bar, you're looking at about 20 to 30 grams of chocolate.
Visualizing that, that's like 2 or 3 squares from a typical bar.
Exactly. 2 or 3 squares, depending on the size of the mold. It is not the whole bar.
And calorie-wise, what are we talking about?
That's about 150 to 200 calories. And this is vital. You cannot just add this on top of your current diet and expect to be healthy.
Right.
If you just add 200 calories of fat a day, you will gain weight. And weight gain is bad for your blood pressure and your insulin sensitivity. You have to swap it.
So replace the after-dinner cookie or the glass of wine or the bag of chips with the 2 squares of dark chocolate.
Precisely. It has to be a substitution. Treat it like a supplement that happens to have calories.
What about timing? You mentioned that 2-hour window for the brain boost.
If you have a big presentation or a difficult task you need to focus on, have your squares in the morning or early afternoon. Let that blood flow peak right when you need it most.
Probably not at night.
I would strongly advise against it. Theobromine is milder than caffeine, but it is still a stimulant. And there is some caffeine in dark chocolate, maybe a quarter of what's in a cup of coffee.
So they could mess with your sleep.
If you're sensitive, eating it at 8 p.m. could definitely interfere with your deep sleep architecture. I'd say treat it like a mild tea. Cut it off by 6 p.m. at the latest.
There was one more practical tip I saw in the research about synergy. There's some debate about consuming it with milk.
This is a long-standing debate. Some early studies suggested that milk protein's casein specifically might bind to the flavanols in the stomach and prevent you from absorbing them.
Is that still the consensus?
The newer research is a bit mixed. It might not be as bad as we first thought, but if your goal is to maximize absorption, why risk it? Don't wash your dark chocolate down with a big glass of cow's milk.
What should you eat it with then?
Fat. The cocoa butter in the chocolate is a fat, but adding a little extra healthy fat, like a small handful of almonds or walnuts, might actually help with the absorption of these fat-soluble compounds.
Plus, the nuts would blunt any potential blood sugar spike.
Completely. A trail mix of walnuts and 85% dark chocolate chunks is probably the ultimate brain snack.
That sounds like a power snack.
It is.
Okay, before we wrap up, we need to do a quick safety check. We already mentioned the blood thinners. What about MAOIs?
Yes. MAOIs are a class of older antidepressants. Fermented foods, including chocolate, contain a compound called tyramine.
Okay.
If you're on an MAOI, your body can't break down tyramine properly. And eating high tyramine foods can cause a dangerous spike in blood pressure, a hypertensive crisis. It's a rare interaction these days, but it's a serious one.
So if you're on one, you probably already know to avoid aged cheeses and cured meats.
And chocolate is on that list too.
And finally, the dog myth. Is it a myth that chocolate is toxic to dogs?
It is absolutely not a myth. Please, please do not give your dog dark chocolate.
Why are we okay and they're not?
Humans can metabolize theobromine very efficiently. We have the liver enzymes for it. Dogs do not. It stays in their system for a much longer time and becomes toxic.
And dark chocolate is more dangerous.
Because 85% chocolate is so concentrated in theobromine, a very small amount can be fatal for a small dog. Keep it on the top shelf, away from pets.
Good advice.
Mm-hmm.
So let's try to summarize this entire deep dive into a protocol for the listener.
Let's do it.
We are looking for 85% or higher cacao content. We are checking the label to ensure it is not processed with alkali no Dutching.
Number one priority.
We're aiming for 20 to 30 grams a day. That's about 2 through 3 squares. We are swapping other calories for it, not adding it on top.
Crucial.
And we're consuming it earlier in the day to aid our brain and avoid any sleep issues.
That is the perfect prescription. It's about being intentional. It moves chocolate from the category of guilty pleasure to functional food.
I want to leave the listener with one final, slightly provocative thought that I found deep in the stack of papers. It wasn't in the main headlines because it's still pretty theoretical, but it was about epigenetics.
The age and clock study. I was hoping you'd bring this up.
Yes. There is emerging research suggesting that theobromine might actually interact directly with our DNA. Specifically, that it might slow down the aging clock of our cells.
It's fascinating stuff. The theory involves something called DNA methylation.
Okay.
Essentially, as we age, the chemical markers on our DNA that tell our cells how to be a skin cell or how to be a heart cell start to get messy. They drift.
And that drift is a sign of aging.
That epigenetic drift is a core hallmark of aging. And some very early data suggests that theobromine helps maintain the integrity of those methylation patterns.
So in a way, it helps our cells remember how to be young and functional.
That is the hope. Now, this is very new science. We are not promising eternal youth in a chocolate bar.
Of course not.
But if this holds up in further research, it shifts the entire conversation from heart health to longevity in a very fundamental way. It suggests that this food interacts with the very blueprint of our biology.
It changes chocolate from a treat to a staple.
It really does.
So here is your homework, listener.
Yeah.
Go to your pantry right now,
Mm.
pick up that bar of dark chocolate or that tub of baking cocoa, turn it over and look at the ingredients.
And if you see the word alkali or Dutch,
you know what to do.
get the real stuff.
Your arteries, your brain, and maybe, just maybe, your DNA will thank you for it. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
We'll see you next time.